Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's race week for the Singapore Grand Prix. Toto Wolff gives his opinion on Max Verstappen's chances of overhauling both McLaren drivers and winning this year's World Championship, especially possible it seems now on what Red Bull have said today, admitting that Singapore is not a guaranteed win for Max, but what they can guarantee is that it's going to be much better than the last time we were at a similar circuit when we had the Budapest Grand Prix that was an absolute disaster for Red Bull. They say it's going to be a very different story this weekend, but really Max needs to win if he wants to keep this hunt alive. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Just starting with this on the screen because yesterday, if you guys didn't see the video, there are some rumours that Charles Leclerc has had some conversations with some other teams. Whether anything comes of that, time will only tell. But Max arrives to Singapore having never won this Grand Prix, despite the fact that every other calendar track on this year's calendar he has now won at. Singapore is the outlier there. He will need to win, as I say, to try and keep these ambitions alive. But many people are saying today, as we'll see in the coming minutes, that is far from an impossibility. It's Grand Prix weekends, the C3, the C4, the C5 tyre. Not an incredibly tough circuit on the tyres Singapore, but as we've known from the last couple of years, it is a track that tends to go one stop unless there's a safety car which opens the door to a two-stop, as we saw a couple of years ago famously when Sainz held off Lando for that remarkable win. In that, well, when the two Mercedes pitted, and maybe there was a world where if Hamilton had been in third rather than Russell, who eventually crashed out, could have been a different story that weekend. But that's Singapore. They've obviously changed the track to get rid of that bridge section over the last couple of years. And it's been an entertaining Grand Prix over the last couple of seasons, capped off to some extent by Daniel Ricciardo scoring the fastest ever lap at the track because of the track changes, among other things, to take away last year's Lando Norris fastest lap. It would have been a grand slam for Lando. Daniel took it away. He then bowed out of Formula 1 very much shortly afterwards, and as a consequence got the fastest lap point taken away from Formula 1. So definitely a legendary weekend last time around. Speaking of drivers, there's been some thoughts on Mick Schumacher, what he might look to do. Couple of options out there for Mick. He is currently and has done a great job, I think, in the World Endurance Championship racing for Alpine. But as he says, sports cars has been fun, but single-seaters is something I burn for and I love. I'm excited to get back into it. So it feels like that's what Mick wants to do. Will he get an opportunity in F1? This is a very good question. The likely possibility right now is a move to IndyCar, quite possibly, because he's got a test coming up very shortly. The race talking about it right here, that he's got this IndyCar test. The understanding is if he does pretty well in this test, he's likely to be offered a race seat in IndyCar for next season. That feels like a plausible eventuality for him. He's not going to get the Cadillac drive, which we thought that he might, because those seats are now filled, and really there's not any other seats that he can actually take. If you're Mick, what do? Take a reserve drive? Is it possible that he could get a reserve drive at a Cadillac? But of course they're also committing to Colton Herta. Colton Herta, by the way, can't be Cadillac's reserve driver because he doesn't have the super license points, but he can be their test driver. So maybe there's still an option for Mick. I think Drugovich has recently signed a deal to drive in Formula E. So Schumacher maybe has a couple of options, but I think he would probably take an Indy seat rather than some sort of reserve F1 drive, but who knows? We'll see what time says on that one. Ralf Schumacher, though, admits that he's running out of time in terms of getting a actual proper seat in Formula 1 and having a comeback. There's also talk about Aston Martin, because over the next couple of years, we are expecting a seat, or maybe two seats, who knows, to open up at Aston Martin, and a team that seems to be becoming increasingly competitive over time. Certainly that is the trajectory they seem to be currently on. There is talk from Aston Martin. The wider driving squad for next year will be announced in due course. So it's Stroll, it's Alonso, but who else, right? What's, with Drugovich, as I say, potentially out of the picture, what's the other option there, right? Is there a Yuki possibility with the Honda partnership? If Yuki doesn't get the Alpine seat, if he does get kicked out of Red Bull, and maybe he feels like he doesn't want to drive at Racing Bulls, even if they still wanted him to stay, he might be better off considering an alternative. I think if I'm Yuki and I get offered a reserve driver opportunity at Aston Martin, if I've got no other options, it's not a bad one to go for, because it's pretty likely that there will be a seat of that team available in the next couple of years. So it's something at least to think about if you're Yuki Tsunoda, given the Honda partnership, which is still going to be there to some degree. Now, Alonso gave some further colour on how things are going at Aston Martin. Maybe not the news that you would love to hear from Alonso if you're an Alonso fan, but nonetheless probably relatively pragmatic. Alonso will turn 45 next year and says it's very possible that they could win races next year with Aston Martin. It's obviously far from a guarantee, but he says we've got the right people, we've got the right facilities, all the tools are there, it's up to us. At the same time in F1 you need some time to glue everything together, saying there's no guarantee he'll continue beyond next year. We saw his comments yesterday that if the car is good, maybe not spectacular, but if it's good, he has a good season, he might just say, you know what, I'll call it a day. I think Alonso would just love to get another race win. I think that's probably what's on the card to him. He would just love to get number 33 and then walk away. And he says if there is a season of being competitive, he will probably call it a day, but he warns against lofty expectations. Here you need a couple of years until the organisation is completely free of any friction or any things that slow down. There's a great chance that next year we are competitive, but what I can say is that there is a guarantee that Aston Martin will be competitive in the next 5 or 10 years, but I probably won't be driving then, so we'll see. My mission is to make that time period as short as possible because I want to enjoy behind the wheel that success. So look, Alonso is giving us a guarantee that Aston Martin will be competitive. Now, what does competitive mean precisely? I mean, theoretically, that means competing for the championship, right? At bare minimum, certainly winning plenty of races would be considered to be competitive. He reckons that is going to happen at some point, the way that things are moving, but there could be some hiccups that get in the way for the next couple of years, and that might just be a little bit too late for Alonso to continue the career going. Who knows, maybe 2035, Fernando Alonso world champion at 54. We'll see about that. But it's Max Verstappen's birthday today. He turns 28 years old. These are his numbers, though, around Singapore. Not quite as good as his overall career, but as we know, Baku has been considered one of Max's weakest tracks. Not because Max has been bad there, but mainly because his teammate Perez was just exceptionally good at Baku. Perez's strengths as a driver very much enjoyed 90-degree corners when, it's not a front-limited circuit around Baku. It's very much so rear-limited. Those were characteristics that Sergio Perez very much enjoyed. And last year, Max was genuinely set to be out-qualified by and finish behind Perez, if not for the Perez-Sainz crash at the end of that Grand Prix, which was just so shambolic for so many reasons. But this year, Max turns up to a circuit where people are like, oh, well, Max isn't all that around Baku. Dominates the Grand Prix from start to finish. Now, Singapore also not been one of Max's best tracks. 3 laps led, 3 podiums. I mean, he's led fewer laps than Antonio Giovinazzi, right? That's famously the stat around here, that Giovinazzi has led 4 laps around Singapore. Max has only led 3. That may well change this year, but it may not, right? Because the last couple of years, the Red Bull has far from been the favourite at this particular circuit. Of course, the only track where Max, or at least Red Bull, did not win in 2023 with the RB19, it was a track that exposed that car's, it didn't have many weaknesses, that car at all. It was arguably the best Formula 1 car in terms of dominance that's ever been built. But it did have weaknesses over the curbs, over the bumps, over the curbs, and the Singapore circuit exposed it pretty badly. That does not seem to be as big of an issue for the Red Bull nowadays, especially because they have brought more upgrades than anybody else. And it's not just true this for Red Bull, it's also true for Racing Bulls, because there was a period this season, Hadjar had started very strong this year, and Yuki was pretty good the first couple of rounds as well, but they did pretty well at the start of the season. But after that, it looked like the Racing Bulls was falling away to some degree. They had a few races where they were struggling to get into Q3. But actually, in the same way that Red Bull have brought upgrades, Racing Bulls have done the same thing, and all of a sudden, Red Bull are giving McLaren a run for its money. Racing Bulls are challenging the Williams, right? They're getting particularly competitive. P5 for Lawson, the last Grand Prix, very important result. There's some understanding they've gained about their car, but also, they've just brought upgrades, right? Racing Bulls brought more upgrades in Baku. It's not something we talk often about because the focus is usually at the front of the field with the Red Bull upgrades, which they also brought, but most cars are at a standstill and have been for some time. These two teams, that is not the case. And that is also good for Max, right? Because at the end of the day, if it wasn't for Lawson being P5, then Yuki wouldn't have been stuck behind him and Lando wouldn't have been stuck behind him, right? So for Max, if the goal for Red Bull is to win Max the championship, then the Racing Bulls being more competitive is relevant, because if the Racing Bulls can actually hold up a McLaren, for example, then, or even just give Yuki a tow to make sure that Lando can't get by, whatever the eventuality is, that helps Max. But it's still a tall order, right? It's still got to be said. 69 points, 7 races to go, 3 sprints as well, so that is something. Plenty of points still up for grabs, but it is a serious deficit to overturn, and it will need to be delved into again this weekend in Singapore. Laurent Mekies therefore comments on it, because this is really the test now, right? We had Monza, we had Baku. I think after Monza, it was expected the Red Bull would be pretty damn competitive at Baku. In the end, based on the way things went in qualifying, so many crashes, Piastri crashes, Norris hits the wall, the rain was coming down, right? There was so many things that led to Max being on pole ahead of Sainz and Lawson, which meant that really he was never going to be challenged in that Grand Prix, given how consistent in his execution Max Verstappen is. That Singapore's a totally different challenge. But Red Bull and Toto, as we'll see in a second, seem to believe that actually they've got a good chance here, right? We know that Budapest was a disastrous Grand Prix and is one that many, I mean, even the year before, 2024, was not a fun time for Max. This year was atrocious. He finished behind Lawson, didn't he, right? Like, he was just driving around, had really no pace at all. And Budapest is a very much high downforce, slow speed corner at times circuit. So the concern for Red Bull would be that going to Singapore, there could be some similar characteristics there, right? The last couple of years, the cars that have done quite well in Budapest have also done quite well in Singapore, I would say. Seems to me anyway, top of my head, that there's some sort of a correlation there. Now, of course, good cars tend to be good cars, obviously, but, you know, cars that tend to work better in the slow speeds tend to be good in Hungary and in Singapore. Now, the Red Bull was terrible in Hungary, so what does that mean for Singapore? But Laurent Mekies says that actually they've changed a lot. In the slow corners of Baku with extremely low downforce, the combination worked very well. We know that they had not much wing on the Red Bull, but the new floor they've brought to their car enabled them in Baku, which, like, the curbs, the bumps on the circuit, not as severe as Singapore at times. But, you know, it is a street track at the end of the day. It's not totally flat like a traditional racing circuit would be expected to be. And the low downforce and the new floor version of the car worked very well. They didn't have the understeer in the slow speed corners, and Max was just as fast through the slower speed sections as the McLarens were, and then gained a bit on the straights. As he goes on to say, I think we have made the car faster since Hungary. I don't think Singapore will be a second Budapest. There was also, maybe another variation of that quote or something similar, but this one even felt a little bit stronger. It's probably fair to say that we have unlocked a bit of performance out the car after Budapest. I don't think Singapore will be a repeat of that, so I'm more confident than that. It is going to be enough to fight for the win. Honestly, we can't say, but it won't be like Budapest. So he's absolutely certain that it's not going to be that bad. The question whether they can win, that's another debate. But I think Mekies and Red Bull are at least confident that Max could do it. Now, Toto has some thoughts on this as well. He also apparently has confirmed today. Now, technically, Toto's already confirmed this. He said in an interview a little while ago that, yes, George and Kimi are going to stay, no questions asked, which is expected and will happen. But it's just like, where's the contract, right? Like, are we going to announce it? What's happening here? Toto says Kimi's going to be here. Toto says George is going to be here. And they will be, I'm sure. But, would be expecting to see some sort of a contract, you would imagine, by now. Especially because Toto, most of his time currently is spent talking about Max. And the fact that he wants Max and whatever. It may well happen at some point. But Toto describes how it was kind of personal conversations that they had during the course of the summer break when there was lots of discussion on that. It was more on a personal level. We didn't discuss big sporting matters too much in the summer. But he did go on to say a little bit more about the chances that Max has. I think you've always got to stay feet on the ground and humble. He's had a good run. The car is good. And it's Max. You always got to be wary of what he can achieve, especially if seeing that he's actually back on the cards. It's a long shot. Things need to work out in his favour. But you can see with a DNF for the leader, as in Piastri, and Max scoring 25 points, it can swing quickly. So Toto definitely believes that Max can do it, kind of as if he's his own driver somehow. But look, they were clearly bolstering their personal relationship over the summer break, so maybe understandable that Toto's going to back his man, even though he's not his man. But it's pretty funny how it works out. I think that Toto will love Max to beat the McLarens. because, as I've said a couple of times, these last 2 years have been quite embarrassing for Mercedes. They've been overhauled, dramatically so, by a customer team that were nowhere at the start of these regs and have finished with by far the fastest car. Mercedes have done none of that over the last 4 seasons. So Toto, I think, would like Max to at least get another victory on the board against the McLarens. Is it possible in Singapore? This weekend is going to be critical in that sense. I'll also quickly, just before we discuss a couple of other things, look up the weather for the weekends. Because it is possible that there is some disruption here. As you guys can see, as always, pretty hot, pretty humid out there in Singapore right now. But this is the Friday. Thundery showers and light winds, right? So it's not like 90% showers, heavy precipitation. But there is something going on here, right? On the Saturday qualifying day, looks like potentially rain, thunderstorms, 40% chance of rain at a point. Sunday right now is looking a lower chance. I guess we should really be looking later in the day here because of the local times in Singapore. So as it stands, it's probably not all that likely, although the Friday is definitely disruptible. And who knows, right? If it rains on the Sunday, look, we've had wet starts in Singapore before, and the most recent one I can remember ended in pretty dramatic fashion. So yes, that's the potential for Singapore. There's talk about Mercedes working on their new engine. Production of the first components for 2026 has begun. I'm sure that will come as no surprise. Just a couple of clarifications on what we said yesterday on Ferrari and what's happening over there. So they've lost a couple of top guys. Wolf Zimmerman, Lars Schmidt, they're gone. So this guy, Enrico Gualtieri, is going to have full control over the 2026 power unit, while integration with the chassis has been strengthened. Within the technical office, Loic Serra will be one of the key figures for 2026, alongside head of aero, Diego Tondi. So those are names that you should be relatively familiar with. If you're not, you'll probably hear me talk about them again on the channel. The other key thing, you've got Frank Sanchez, you've got Loic Serra, you've got Diego Tondi. Those are like the 3 top technical guys. And Vasseur, the question is, should they keep a more horizontal management style where they kind of all make the decisions, or does there need to be a talisman, right? Like a key decision maker? And apparently that is now changing. Vasseur will call the shots in some regard. He will listen to his men and what they suggest, then he will make the final decision as to what direction they go in. And will this work? We'll see. But I think that anything from Ferrari to kind of reduce some level of bureaucracy, have like one decision maker who calls the shots, that is probably for the best for that organisation, I would suggest. And it looks like Vasseur has either been given or is just taking that power for the upcoming season. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Just one final thing. I don't know what you guys think about this. So the race did this fan census, and they, the race's audience, they voted in this. Now, I don't really believe this, but intrigued to your thoughts anyway, because, most popular drivers, I mean, really, it's got to be Lewis and Max, hasn't it? You would think. Maybe not. I don't know. I actually think it is very competitive. I don't see a world where Piastri is somehow dominating this vote. So, I would take it with a bit of a pinch of salt in terms of these numbers. Not to say Piastri isn't a popular driver, because he is. But for him to have way more of a percentage than any of these other particularly popular drivers seems quite unlikely to me. But anyway, take it as you will. This was maybe a more interesting vote for the most underrated Formula 1 driver. Now, I always find these discussions quite fascinating when we discuss underrated, because if you ask people who's underrated and they all say the same guy, the likelihood is they're probably not actually underrated. And they're, for example, Bortoletto, maybe. Like, I think he's definitely in this conversation, and for good reason. But if you ask people, okay, who's like the kind of under-the-radar performer who's actually doing really well, lots of people would say Bortoletto, which kind of means that, well, actually, people do rate him, right? Not to say that he's not as good as people think he is, but there's a nuance here, right, to this discussion of underrated. And if everyone is like, oh, Albon's so underrated, then it probably means that actually people probably rate him quite fairly. So, I think this discussion is kind of interesting. I think Gasly maybe falls into a similar boat as well. I actually quite like the votes here for Russell. I know that people are going to be like, oh, here he goes again. But I don't know, when I talk to people, they don't rate Russell that highly. Like, Max is Max, right? That's a different discussion. But if you compare Russell to Leclerc, if you compare Russell to Norris, Russell to Piastri, right? These type of conversations, I think often people will have Russell kind of towards the bottom end of the discussion I've just had. But in reality, I think Russell should actually be right at the top of that list. So I think I'd give more credence to that. But again, maybe I'm biased. Intro to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below as ever. So hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.